started all together so many years ago. Danced in the sunshine and made angels in the snow. Our lives were filled with innocence. This world, it turned so slow. Now my most beloved friend, together we grow old.
We all have to know what to do with our anger and our pain and our grief. We don't have the right vocabulary. That's one of the problems we have. We're not at war. There's no such thing as war going on. We're slaughtering women and children. 80–90% of every one of these strikes is women and children. That's the demography. That's who lives there. And did you know it's a war crime to kill a defenseless soldier? Always has been. You can't kill an armed combatant that's defenseless. If they had rounded them up on the ground and then shot them down, that'd be an outcry across the world, but you can do it by technology now. Every drone, every cruise missile, every bomber strike, and it's all being put together, you can call it airstrikes. You don't know what it is.
Collateral damage.
It's a crime. It's a crime. And I was with two of these children earlier this afternoon. Gorgeous. 12-year-old Yusuf, arm, leg. 12-year-old boy starting out in life will never again have his right arm or his right leg. Wonderful prosthetic clinic in Dorchester. Going to do the best we can. Little Sahar, most beautiful little child you'll ever see in your life, and you wonder how can she still smile the way she does, with both legs above the knees. And her mother was weeping in tears at the prosthetic clinic where she's going to get help, because that's the moment, you know, once again, she knows my child will never have her feet, her knees, her legs again, at the very beginning of her life. So, you know, I really am grateful for your anger and your passion and the conviction that it comes out of your life. And Brian Wilson used to say, you know, there's going to be no healing for a veteran until they come home and tell the truth, until they come home and work with their whole life to renounce and address and confront this criminality. Tell the truth. Well, my task here is to introduce David and John Hartsough. And you know, when there's a lot to say, you don't know exactly what you're going to say. But I always trust a little leading, and you know, this evening there's a lot of Quakers here, a lot of friends. David and John are members of the San Francisco Friends Meeting, birthright friend, lifelong Quaker. So I listened to this little leading, and you know, it led me to Dr. King's last sermon, the last Sunday before he was assassinated. And he began to tell the old story of Rip Van Winkle, Washington Irving, slept 20 years. He said, you know, it was all about that sign. When he went up to the mountain and went to sleep, there was a picture of King George III. And when he came down, there was a picture of George Washington. And he had slept through a revolution. King is addressing people to not sleep through a revolution. And that helped me a lot, because I realized we are in the midst of a revolution. And a lot of times we go back to sleep. A lot of times we don't know. But this is the revolution. This is the last moment for humanity. As Dr. King said, it's not nonviolence or violence. It's nonviolence. It's the renunciation of this murderous criminality or non-existence. And nuclear weapons are on hair trigger and are deployed throughout Russia, Ukraine, Middle East. It's an armed camp. A student at Endicott asked David the other day, he said, hasn't it guaranteed peace for 70 years? And we tried to give an answer. and give a more succinct answer to you, there has been no peace for 70 years. And having a nuclear weapon pointed at your head is not what I would call peace. And are you going to say that 8 different countries with nuclear weapons in the most conflicted areas, India, Pakistan, China, Russia, Israel, United States, everywhere, is peace? Or that it will go on, that these systems, these computers, these personnel are going to be safe forever. David, I'm so thrilled you're here. He's been part of the revolution since the FBI opened a file on him at age 15, organizing a protest at a Nike base. Probably everybody here remembers the Nikes around all the cities. I don't know how many of you know that the military leaders, who Merton called the blindest of the blind, and we'll tell you this story just so we know what the kind of blindness and life-threatening, creation-threatening blindness it is. Our Nike base on Route 1, the military said, what if these missiles that don't exist at that time and these planes that don't exist from Russia, what if one of them should get through? And our missile didn't shoot them down, so they put a nuclear weapon on the tip of every Nike missile, a nuclear Hercules. What about the people in Boston? Collateral damage. David was not sleeping through a revolution. Now, I know what it is to sleep through a revolution because while David was out there for 20 years, I was sound asleep. We crossed paths at Swarthmore College, and he, sitting in a friend's meeting, had the leading, this is the time for you to go to Howard University, one of the few white students at Howard University, a leading, the voice of God, sitting in friend's meeting. And he went. He dropped out. He's a dropout. He's a Swarthmore dropout. Boy. And here is a Swarthmore sleeping right through it. Sleeping through it all. I'm 20 years behind, and at least. A slow learner, a sleeper. But David, awake. And the remarkable thing with his wife, Jan, to be awake in a marriage and with 2 children, Peter and Heidi, family. There's a picture in the book, a beautiful picture of the whole family being arrested in front of the White House in 1971. Being told, your children will be taken from you. This is not just the ordinary arrest. You don't move, your children are going into custody. And they didn't move. When we're 1 million in New York City, remembering that moment in 1982, maybe we feel like we are part of a revolution. But when we're vigiling down in Ipswich tomorrow, are we going to know that we are part of a revolution? And it is ongoing, and it is global, and it is in every community, it is across this country. And because the times are quiet and nobody pays any attention, and you just wish they would shout out, go to Russia or get a job, but they don't even pay attention to you, we are still in the midst of this revolution. And I remember Dr. King going to Birmingham, knowing that the entire white population would be against him, but knowing that the black population wouldn't move an inch. And he said, our goal is 5%. We only need 5%. We know 95% are too terrified, are too oppressed. 5%. And of course he couldn't get 5%. It was a total failure until the children came out. And they said he was exploiting children. You don't want to have 8-year-olds and 10-year-olds and 12 and 15. And the children came out and they said, we want our freedom. I ain't scared of your jail, Pete Seeger. I ain't scared of your jail because I want my freedom. And I want my freedom now. David's book is so important because it'll take us through all that history, through that revolution, its high points, its low points, its loud points, it's when it's noticed and when it's ignored. David was on the tracks with Brian. Most of you were here when Brian spoke about 2 years ago. David had helped organize the Nuremberg action, trying to apply the law to the U.S. government. And he was one of 4 people immediately able to miraculously save the life of Brian Wilson.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for all that you've been doing to help work for a peaceful and just world. I know it hasn't been easy, and it's been a long time struggle. And I was actually once in a meditation in which I was just sitting in a very beautiful place that happened to be in Switzerland, and the suggestion was that somebody is going to come to visit you. And out of the silence, somebody came and put their hands on my shoulders. And I heard his voice, and it was Martin Luther King. And he says, David, he says, I want you to know that working for peace and justice in the world can be a lonely struggle. And I want you to know that I'm going to be with you. And that's been very empowering to me. Even when we're out there with just a few people on the vigil line, we're not alone. And King's spirit is certainly with us. Our nation is addicted to war. And many governments are addicted to war in the same way that people get addicted to alcohol. It's something that grabs us, it has you by the throat, and it's hard to kick the habit. Millions of people are dying. Hundreds of millions of people are refugees from these wars. And that's kept a secret from most of us. We have to work hard to really find out about that, or to feel the pain and suffering of people. And there's also the terrible injustice in the world. We in the United States are about 4.5% of the world's population and are consuming about 25% of the world's resources. That's about 6 times our share. In order for us to follow our greed and our voracious appetite, some other people are starving to death and are hungry and can't feed their children. And that has to change. To me, the good news is that people all over the world have discovered the power of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent action, to challenge injustice and violence and empire. And in the last 30, 40 years, there have been major nonviolent movements all over the world that have thrown out dictatorships. In the Philippines, in Egypt, in all over Eastern Europe, in Yugoslavia, in Liberia, in Chile, in South Africa. It's estimated that most of the people in the world live in worlds where there have been major nonviolent movements. So it's not just a few Quakers or Unitarians or Veterans for Peace that have discovered the power of nonviolence. It's happening all over the world. And people aren't just sitting on that belief. They're acting on it. And when governments will not listen to people, they are insisting that the governments listen. And if they don't, they move into massive nonviolent resistance and change the government. Well, I think that's an example for what we can do. Johann Galtung, one of the fathers of the peace studies programs that are happening all over the world now, and he's done mediation in many, many conflicts, Norwegian in his heritage. He said a couple of years ago, he says, the American empire will be over by 2020. The world is not going to put up with it. And we're already seeing that process. I don't know whether it's exactly 2020, but I think the world is going to change. The American empire, like all empires, is going to end. And the really only question is that going to happen violently with wars all over the world where we hold on to that power and privilege and domination, or is it going to be a largely peaceful transformation where American people will be working with the people of the world to try to help bring about this change peacefully. I had the very good fortune of growing up with a lot of what I call spiritual giants that I got to know. People like Byron Rustin, Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, Steve Carey, that some of you know from the American Friends Service Committee. And these people kind of set the example for me of not sleeping through a revolution, of putting their lives to the task to try to help bring about major change in our society and the world, nonviolently. And partly as a result of my dad taking my brother and me to Montgomery, Alabama in 1956 during the Montgomery bus boycott, and experience nonviolence, not just as a philosophy, but as a method of change. And people getting up an hour earlier in order to walk to work rather than ride the buses, segregated buses. And people saying, we're going to continue to love these people. We're not going to cooperate, but we're not going to hate them. We're going to love these people. It was quite a profound example for me when I was 15 years old. And partly as a result of that, I've spent most of my life helping build nonviolent movements and participate in nonviolent movements in different parts of the world. And in Gandhi's words, experimenting with the power of nonviolence. And in this book, Waging Peace, Global Adventures of a Lifelong Activist, I just try to share some of those stories and experiences in nonviolent movements over the last 60 years. My feeling is that one of the problems that we have in this country and in other parts of the world to some extent is a sense of hopelessness and powerlessness. And we can't, the problem is so overwhelming, there's nothing we can do to change it. And that's exactly what the power structure wants us to think and to feel. And somehow we have to realize that we're not alone, and there are people all over the world that are struggling for a really transformation of this society and of the world. And so I'd like to just share several examples of these stories. As John mentioned, after 1 year at Swarthmore, I transferred to Howard University in the fall of 1959. And that was just 4 months or so before the 4 students in Greensboro sat in at a lunch counter where they were not fed and they were thrown in jail. And that was like the Rosa Parks story. Those 4 students refusing to be silent in the face of this oppression and willing to go to jail for their beliefs, touched a spark in students throughout the South of this country, black students especially. And at Howard University, we discovered, or we already knew, but we researched it a bit, the restaurants and eating facilities in Washington, D.C. were desegregated, but in Maryland and Virginia, they were all segregated. So even African ambassadors traveling between the UN and Washington could not eat, in the eating facilities along in Maryland. So we started going to lunch counters up in Maryland, usually on a Saturday morning. They'd close the lunch counter, arrest us, we'd go to jail and sing freedom songs. Monday morning we'd be released and go back to classes. So that was most of my weekends in my sophomore year in college. So my criminal record began relatively early. The state of Virginia had passed a law saying anyone that challenged the segregation law there could get 6 months in prison, a $500 fine. And the American Nazi Party was also there, threatening to kill people that challenged the segregation laws. So we kept going to Maryland, for reasons you might guess. But in June, after our final exams, there was sit-ins all across the South, but nothing in Virginia. And we decided somebody has to challenge this, this law. And so we did additional nonviolence training, and 12 of us went down to a People's Drug Store, mostly black and me. And the lunch counter was closed as usual, but this store owner didn't want the bad publicity, so he didn't arrest us. But he also wasn't going to serve us. And so we stayed there for 2 days. And it was the most challenging 2 days of my life. People came and spat at us. They called us every name in the book. They put lit cigarettes down our shirt of our back. People punched us in the stomach so hard we'd fall onto the floor, and then they would kick us. And each time we would try to respond in a loving, nonviolent way. It was pretty hard. the American Nazi Party did come with their swastikas. And toward the end of the second day, I heard a guy behind me. He says, "You nigger lover, if you don't get out of this store in 2 seconds, I'm going to stab this through your heart." And in his hand was a switchblade. And by that time, I only had 2 seconds to think about, is nonviolence really something that I can use in this kind of situation? Or is that something that's nice for Sunday school or, sitting around in a comfortable living room? But we'd had a lot of practice, and I just looked him in the eye and I said, "Well, friend, do what you believe is right, but I'll still try to love you." And his face that was contorted with hatred, the jaw began to drop, and the hand with the switchblade began to fall, and he left the store, which was kind of a powerful experience for a 20-year-old about the power of nonviolence. But then we did something even more challenging. This had been in the front page of the paper. This was the second day. And 500 people were outside threatening violence. And we wrote a statement and then read it at the front door of this People's Drug Store, appealing to religious and community leaders of Arlington to use their influence to get the businesses to open up the eating facilities. And then this was the hard part. We said, if nothing changes, we'll be back in a week. And some friendly media people got us back into Washington alive. And literally we shook for 6 days. Did we have the courage to go back and do this again? And on the 6th day, we got a phone call that the religious and community leaders had met and had talked with the business leaders and had a commitment that the eating facilities would be open within 10 days. So that was the most important lesson in my life. That when something terrible and horrendous is happening, you don't have to just curse the television set or the President of the United States or the local segregation leader or the generals. You can actually do something. You find some other people that feel the same as you do, and you can courageously, nonviolently resist that and help bring about change and help change history. And that's what people all over the world have been discovering. And that's led to my life of experimentation with nonviolence. A second story I'll share was during the Vietnam War, when the United States was 1971. At Christmas time, we'd been bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail and all parts of Vietnam, but not the major cities, and not the major cities in North Vietnam. And at Christmas time, we started bombing Hanoi and Haiphong, each with millions of people in it. And we were living in the Life Center, Movement for New Society in Philadelphia, and had a worship service where we tried to get in touch with the pain and the suffering of the people that were living under those bombs. And then to look at what are we led to do to try to stop this horrendous thing that's been done in our name and with our tax dollars. And as you were saying, according to the Nuremberg principles, this is a war crime, and being silent in the face of a war crime is also a war crime. So we had not only a moral responsibility, we had a legal international responsibility to try to do what we could to stop it. And because we lived in community, we could support one another, and we came to the feeling we somehow should put our bodies between these bombs and the people of Vietnam, and that we would support each other in doing that. We had young kids, and I got in prison for a long time, or killed, or other people would help pay the rent and that kind of stuff. Well, we found out that in Leonardo, New Jersey, just about an hour and a half away, was a naval depot that was sending arms and munitions to Vietnam every week. And that was a lot easier than going to Hanoi and Haiphong and being in those cities under the bombs. And many of us loved canoeing. And I've always liked to put my love of nature together with my political police. And so we formed a sea blockade. We had 26 canoes with 52 people that actually were going to attempt to block this ship, which is called the USS Nitro, from leaving for Vietnam. And as we paddled out along the piers and saw the napalm and anti-personnel weapons, etc., a military policeman with his bullhorn said, "You're going to be charged with criminal conspiracy. If you don't leave the area, you could get 20 years in prison." And we kind of gulped and kind of yelled back, and we said, "Well, thank you for warning us, but if these bombs reach their destination, it's going to be even worse than 20 years in prison," and kept paddling. Well, on the 6th day, we actually met some of the sailors who were not very pleased about being on the ship. And it was not only the whole bottom part of the ship, was that hold, that was filled with bombs and munitions. The crates were about 15, 20 feet high on the deck all the way around. And it was totally unsafe, as well as kind of a ship of death. They told us that it was going to leave at 6 o'clock the next morning, so we were out there early that morning. And as we were paddling madly to try to stay right in front of the ship, they began to lift anchor. And all these sailors were up on the deck of the ship. And 7 of them jumped off of the ship into the ocean and began swimming toward nonviolent blockade. And we called the New York Times and the TV stations, etc. And what those 7 sailors did, went around the world. And they were taken back and put in the hold of the ship, or in the brig. But they told us later that when their ship went through the Panama Canal, all the other Navy ships that they met coming the other way had heard about their resistance and gave them a fist of solidarity. So I like to believe that our courage to try to say we cannot be silent in the face of this action gave courage to these 7 sailors, and their courage gave courage to soldiers, American soldiers all over the world, to begin looking at their own conscience and their own heart and what they were led to do to try to non-cooperate, and the non-cooperation among the military really increased significantly after that. There's similar stories while the clamshell riots stuff was happening here. We were trying to do what we could to try to stop the Diablo Canyon plant from going into operation. And in 1981, when the final license was given, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission said this is the safest nuclear reactor in the world, 1,000 of us were arrested. And as all the men sat in jail, saying, we had done everything we could, but it was still going to go into operation, someone threw a newspaper over the barbed wire fence. And we looked at it, and here was the headlines were that a welder of this plant had gone public that the cooling pipes for that's 2 different reactors. The cooling pipe for the second reactor, the blueprints were upside down when they built the whole cooling system. And this was already on an earthquake fault in addition to that. And so the license was going to cost PG&E another couple $2 billion to rebuild the plant. But again, I like to think that our courage gave this welder, he could have done that, much earlier, and that could have been very dangerous for the whole Northern California. And as I think most of you know, because of the clamshell and abalone and Keystone riots and others around the country, no nuclear reactors were licensed for about 40 years. So it wasn't, we were defeated in the very short term, but in the long term, I think we had a real impact. I've had the good fortune to be in the right place at the right time many parts of my life. I was in Cuba in 1959, right after the revolution. that kind of awoke me to the tremendous discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots in the world. I studied in Berlin, 1960-61, during the Berlin crisis, when the U.S. and the Soviet Union were threatening nuclear war over Berlin. And I was studying in both sides, east and west. And in the eastern side, when I challenged their propaganda, they called me a capitalist warmonger. And in the west, when I challenged the propaganda, I was called a communist conspirator. So if you try to tell the truth, you're not necessarily going to be popular. And unfortunately, I think all over the world, people often get lies. And of course, if the media doesn't challenge those lies, they're not doing their responsibility. I had the good fortune to be a part of a Quaker delegation that met with President Kennedy in May of 1962, where we had about half an hour with him. And among other things, encouraged him to challenge the Russians to a peace race. And the essence of what he said was, if you're serious about wanting me to take this kind of leadership, you're going to have to build a powerful movement to enable me to do this. And he also expressed, he'd been reading The Guns of August, about before World War I, and that he was very concerned how everybody was preparing for war to try to keep us from going to war, keep their nation from going to war, and how similar the situation was in 1962. Well, about a month after I saw him, with a couple other friends, we were praying for end of nuclear weapons testing out in front of the White House, and were arrested, praying without a permit. And yeah, be careful about that. Actually, in the early 60s, in the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, I led 3 groups of students to the Soviet Union on camping trips. Our government was telling us these are the enemy. These are the people that we're going to have to incinerate and wipe off the map, if need be. And they were being told they needed to wipe us off the map. And I thought, we've got to get to know these people. These are human beings. So anyway, I organized 3 trips to the Soviet Union with students just to get to know the Russian people. And it's very, very clear to me that the people nowhere in the world want war. We're not a tiny minority. I think people all over the world are sick and tired of war, and it's the people that are suffering, and it's suffering not only under the bombs, it's suffering because of the cuts in funds for schools, and parks, and job training, and Social Security, and for children's programs, etc. And we've all been propagandized, though. The only way to security is to, as Kennedy was saying, was armed to the hilt. So I've been arrested in the United States for praying for end of nuclear weapons testing. And Americans, the people on the street said, go to Russia. That's where you need to demonstrate. So later that summer, I was in the Soviet Union, and a couple of us had signs saying exactly what they had in front of the White House, which was bomb tests kill people, but in Russian. And again, the people came up and said, why are you demonstrating against our peaceful bombs? We weren't ready when, time of Hitler, and 20 million people, 20 million Russians died, and we're not going to let that happen again. And police came up and said, you can get 20 years in prison for demonstrating against our peaceful bombs. So again, we said, in response, we said, 20 years is a very long time, but if the arms race continues, none of us are going to be alive. And we demonstrated a month ago at the White House, and we're making the same appeal to the Russian government to stop its nuclear testing. And they said, we've got to talk to our superiors. And so they left to talk with them, and we decided we were going to vigil there, right next to the Lenin Mausoleum in Red Square, for 2 hours. And they hadn't come back, so after 2 hours we went back to our campsite. And I must say I'm happy I didn't have to spend 20 years in prison. Jan and John and I went to Iran several years ago on a very similar kind of mission. We're told that the Iranians are the enemy. But actually in Iran, we not only found friendly people, one of them said to me that all of the world's religions teach that we need to treat one another as we want to be treated. And we need to love one another. And he says, why don't we just do that instead of, threatening to kill each other? And we found out that the U.S. had overthrown the democratically elected government of Iran. Iran has not attacked any country for 200 years. That Iran is surrounded by American military bases. That Iran had the U.S. arming the Iraqi government in the war against Iran, which, how many people? 2 million people died? No. Some 2 million Iranian people. We were also arming, to a lesser extent, the Iranian government, and Kissinger is quoted as saying, we hope they all kill each other. Well, I've also led delegations to Israel and Palestine. And I think it's the same thing there. It's not that, the people want war. All of us, I think, would like to have a sense we can bring up our children without worrying if they're going to get killed, or homes bombed, etc. And just to say a word, the latest campaign that I'm working on is something called World Beyond War. It comes out of our belief that at least 99% of the people in the world, maybe 100%, don't want war. But our governments aren't listening to us. So we need to reach out and discover the people all over the world that also want peace, and to begin to demand that our government stop this insanity. We have a declaration of peace challenge governments that won't listen to people. If your conscience leads, please sign this. At the end of my book, I share lots of stories. I've just shared a few. At the end of the book, I have resources for further study and action, which include some of the lessons learned from my years of activism. What you can do, all the way from very low risk to much higher risk, and then websites and DVDs and books that could help in your search for all of our search for how we can be more effective and relevant in trying to end war and racism and injustice of all types. Everybody knows about A Force More Powerful DVD. I'm like Johnny Appleseed. I've distributed thousands of these in many, many languages all over the world. And it's 6 half-hour stories of powerful nonviolent movements. Resisting dictatorship over it. It's South Africa, it's nonviolent resistance to Hitler in Denmark. It's the Indian struggle for independence. It's the civil rights movement, sit-ins in the South. It is the transformation of South Africa and the nonviolent overthrow of Pinochet in Chile. But I think every school ought to be showing this. Every church should be showing this. I think this can give us some hope. So take a look at that. And then how many people know this book by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, Why Civil Resistance Works? I encourage everybody to take a look at this book. What is being said by our government and by most governments is, nonviolence, can be something you can believe in and, try to practice on a visual line. But if things really come to knocks, violence is what works. Well, Erica was kind of excited about guerrilla warfare as a way to struggle. But these 2 women, both of whom are professors, researched 323 violent and nonviolent movements in very major kind of situations over the last 110 years. And the nonviolent movements were twice as likely to be successful as the violent movements, and were more than twice as likely to end up in a democratic society, not another dictatorship or civil war. I think the people of the world are beginning to understand this, and that's an example. I'm so glad this research has been done, and we need to take that to heart. And I'm sure everybody here is already agrees with this, but it's part of what gives me hope. Let's hear your questions, thoughts, concerns, comments, disagreements. The wall, which is not only surrounding Israel, it is separating Palestinian villages from their farms, from their lands. You probably know this. And in many towns and villages in the West Bank, every Friday after prayer services, people march to the wall, nonviolently, demanding that the wall be removed. And every week they get tear gas and sound bombs and sometimes rubber bullets. And some people have been killed. And the leaders of this movement, the Israeli soldiers, come and take the leaders in the middle of the night from their homes. But that their resistance, their nonviolent resistance is continuing. I know some people that are actually, within the next couple of weeks, planning to talk with the leaders of Hamas about nonviolent struggle as perhaps, or hopefully, a more effective way of challenging the Israeli question and occupation. And obviously what has been happening in Gaza has not worked for anybody. I think Israelis, as you know, probably, are already joining these nonviolent demonstrations in the West Bank. Some of the Israelis there are calling for reconciliation, not for more retaliation one side against the other and back again. So, which is very courageous to do in that kind of a situation. So those are a few of the things. I think for nonviolence to succeed, one, we need a clear nonviolent discipline. Two, we need sustained struggle. It's not going to be over in the first day, the first week, first month. And that's what happened in the civil rights movement. That's what happened in the anti-slavery movement and in the women's suffrage movement, anti-Vietnam War movement. And 4, we need to become a mass movement. And one of the other things that Erica and Maria found out is that if you're engaged in nonviolent struggle, it's much more likely to become a mass movement because everybody can get involved. People aren't going to bring their children, if there's, the police are firing on people. And they've also discovered that in many situations, it's where they've been able to win over the police and the military, which you're not going to win them over by lobbing, Molotov cocktails or whatever at them. But similar to our situation, I think in the sit-ins in the South, I think there's the potential of helping reach the humanity in the other person. And one of the times I was arrested not too long ago in San Francisco, I was talking with the police officer that arrested me, and he says, I would guess that 80% of the police in San Francisco support you. Well, doesn't make sense to alienate these guys. I think peace, as I think you mentioned at the beginning, is not just an isolated, you can't just grab peace out of the air and say, well, let's have it. There is a question of, as I tried to imply, a just sharing of the world's resources, where we treat others as we want them to treat us. Quakers certainly have a space, but I think all religions have this as a part of their religious teaching. I think it is also important to try to live non-violently, as well as try to work for it in the outer world. Partly just to practice what we preach, but also partly that's what's going to attract other people. If we're angry and yelling at people and stuff, it's probably not going to touch other people. It's a very real connection, and I think we need to look more deeply at what it means to live nonviolently in the movement. Often, personal egos can get in the way of people working together. In Iran, we met with some people who were translating and publishing the Nonviolence in Children manual into Iranian, into Farsi. So they were looking at, how do we begin to teach this to our children? And obviously, the epidemic of violence in the schools and neighborhoods and races, it is an epidemic, and it's an addiction that we have to challenge head on. Peaceworkers is a very small NGO in San Francisco. We are attempting to support the spread of nonviolence, active nonviolence, in this country and around the world. So we work with people in the Occupy movement, for instance, to try to help strengthen the understanding of nonviolence. We've been active in the anti-drone action. In Zimbabwe, we've been supporting a group called WOZA, Women of Zimbabwe Arise, who are 80,000 women, many of them illiterate, who are nonviolently challenging their dictatorship. And they want to help, among other things, of how do you teach nonviolence to illiterate people. And now there's actually a men's auxiliary, MOZA, men of Zimbabwe Arise, but the leadership is with the women. We call ourselves a midwife for the Nonviolent Peaceforce that started as work that we did for about 10 years of identifying people and organized groups around the world that wanted to support nonviolent peacekeeping and looking for alternatives to war. So that became kind of the foundation for the Nonviolent Peaceforce. And then Jeju Island is one of the other major struggles. I don't know, do people know about Jeju Island in Korea? The U.S. is talking about, I don't know what's going to happen now with more wars in the Middle East, but a pivot to Asia that's seeing China as the next major enemy. And so we're trying to surround it with military bases and military ports or Navy ports where our massive armed battleships can moor. So Jeju Island is just off the coast of South Korea, and they call it an island of peace. They challenged the Japanese occupation for decades, and then, as did the Koreans in general. And then at the end of the war, when the United States occupied South Korea and said we're going to have special elections in South Korea, it's going to be an anti-communist government. And here their country was going to be divided and occupied, and they didn't cooperate. And so about 40,000 people were killed, assassinated, by the Korean military at the orders of the U.S. Military. They have not even been able to talk about this for over 30 years. And now, a major military base, which is going to be part of the U.S. surrounding China, is going to be built on their island. And the farmers and the fishermen there are intent that their village not just become a huge brothel. And, you know, they're fishermen, you know, I said fishermen and farmers. And their whole life and community be destroyed. So they've been non-violently blocking the cement trucks and bulldozers that are massive trucks. I was over there in April this year, from going in and out of the base. And so we've been sending people to go over to accompany them and to help tell the world. Regis Tremblay is one of the people we sent over, lives up in Maine. Has made a film called The Ghost of Jeju, which is available, and I highly recommend that. John Kennedy once said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable." And so and you know, in the spirit of Martin Luther King and Gandhi, I think we need to help others that are trying to help make nonviolent change. And the alternative, as I said, you know, is we're just going to have wars all over the place. And we've got to work with the people all over the world that are committed to making this transformation peaceful. The one final thing I'd say, and it's partly in response to you, was, and to all of us, I guess, but Brian Wilson, that you referred to earlier, before he was run over by the train, said to the Navy and said to all American people, our lives are not worth more than their lives, the people in Central America in that case. And their lives are not worth less than our lives. And he believes that deeply and tries to live it. And I think it's a very revolutionary way of thinking and being. And if we could get over that mentality that I think has attacked many Americans, that our lives are somehow more important. And so it's all right to drop bombs, and you know, unfortunately, a bunch of civilians may get killed, you know, and all the rest of that. We couldn't do that if we believed that, you know, we're all brothers and sisters, we're all one human family, and our president, at the end of every speech, not just this president, always says, "God bless America." Well, that's kind of like under Hitler, Gott mit uns, God is with us. I mean, I don't think that's not the kind of God I believe in. I mean, God, I think, blesses all of us, and certainly doesn't want us to be killing. The Nonviolent Peace Force does exist, and has over 200 nonviolent peacekeepers now from all over the world. And presently we're in Mindanao, in the Philippines, where there's been a war going on for, you know, with the Muslim who have been declared second-class citizens in a country that was all Muslim. And that ceasefire has held, and the Nonviolent Peace Force has been invited by both sides to come and help monitor that and help transform that ceasefire into an ongoing, you know, lasting peace. And that's been working. We're in South Sudan, which has been a very, very tough situation. And we are beginning a project in Burma, where there's also been conflict between Muslim and Buddhist communities. And there's been exploration about what role we could play in Syria. And several of our people have been there on several exploratory visits. And Mel Duncan, the founding director, has been spending most of his energies now in New York with the United Nations and is doing, I think, a phenomenal job in helping what we call both UN agencies, but also friendly governments, which are, largely Sweden, Norway, Holland, Netherlands, Germany, who are funding some of these projects. But what is not being funded is kind of the overhead, the fundraising, all the work to try to help make these field projects possible. The money has been coming for those projects. And that's what's enabled us to move from 12 people, which we had at the beginning, to 200. And it's about a budget of $8 million now. It's having success with UN agencies and with a number of governments. And what somebody said to me high up in the UN when we started was, we agree with what you're doing, you show it can work, and then we'll do it. So that's the challenge. We felt something more had to happen than Peace Brigades and Witness for Peace, which is doing this on a very small scale. We have to do it on a large enough scale that the world can take notice and say, oh, there's a better way of trying to bring priests to an area that is in violent conflict than bombing or sending the Marines or whatever. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, John, for organizing this.
Yeah, well.
Come and walk with me, for we are brothers and sisters, side by side, walking hand in hand. And if you sing with me, together we will see this song of peace ring throughout the land. Come and sing a simple song of freedom, sing it like you've never sung before. Let it fill the air, tell people everywhere, be the people here no more war. Come and sing a simple song of freedom, sing it like you've never sung before. Let it fill the air, tell people everywhere, be the people here no more war. Let it fill the air, tell the people everywhere, we the people here no more war. Thank you for coming. It's very refreshing and inspirational to have someone like you come and remind us, why we're doing what we're doing, and keep it on, so that kind of thing. As you were talking, I was thinking, I got a song for that. I got another song for that.